So today we're very honored. Our colloquial speaker today is Dr. Kido Lopez, who is a professor in the Department of Communication Arts at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. At Madison, Dr. Lopez is the director of the Asian American Studies program, where she is an affiliated faculty member. She is also affiliate faculty in the Chicano and Latin Studies program and the Gender and Women's Study department. Since 2015, she has organized Madison's Asian American Media Spotlight, which is a local film festival. She also founded the National Race and Media Conference in 2014 and sits on the advisory board of the Center for Critical Race and Digital Studies. With a bachelor's from Pomona College, master's from Indiana University, and PhD from the University of Southern California, Dr. Lopez examines how minority groups use media in their fight for social justice. She studies how mainstream media represent disenfranchised groups and how identities and communities can be transformed via grassroots or activist media, digital media, and consumer culture. These research interests are reflected in a number of books, including Asian American Media Activism, Fighting for Cultural Citizenship, as well as Race and Media, Critical Approaches, both published by NYU Press. Her articles have been published in outlets that include Feminist Media Histories, Communication, Culture, and Critique, the International Journal of Communication, and Media, Culture, and Society. Today, Dr. Lopez joins us to present findings from her latest book, Micromedia Industries, Hmong American Media Innovation in the Diaspora, published by Rutgers University Press. So Lori, thanks for coming. Today, we are very honored to have you. The floor is yours. And before we start, I just want to remind everybody about the Q&A procedure. So as a reminder, if you want to raise a question under reactions, there's this raise hand button. And when you raise your hand in the end of the talk, I will call people by order. And then you can just speak up. So Lori, thanks again. The floor is really yours now. You can take it over.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for all the work you took to assemble that biography. It was a lot of research you put into that. All right. I'm so excited to speak with you all today. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. I've got me up. I'm also going to get the chat up in case anyone wants to catch my attention in the middle of the talk. All right, let's put me here. Okay. So today I'll be talking about my book, Micromedia Industries, Hmong American Media Innovation in the Diaspora. So this is a research project that I started in 2014, which is just a couple of years after I moved to Madison. And since I study Asian American media, I really wanted to learn more about Asian American media in the Midwest. And Hmong Americans are the biggest Asian immigrant community in Wisconsin. Also, UW-Madison has a really strong Hmong American Studies program, or a community of Hmong scholars. So that seemed like a really important area to focus on. So I basically started out by having kind of informal conversations with Hmong Americans in Madison about what kind of media they used, what kind of media they were paying attention to. I learned all sorts of really interesting stuff about what they were doing. And one of the things that interested me the most about this extremely wide variety of Hmong media outlets that I discovered was that they are all very small. So they all had to deal with their small size and scale in some ways. And it struck me that Hmong media might happen to face all these kinds of different challenges around scaling up, but that there are actually tons of other media outlets of all kinds that are in the same situation. So this idea of size and what I'm calling micro media industries is what I'll be focusing on today. Okay, so here's the questions that I planned to answer in my presentation. What are Hmong media? So how is that a useful and important concept for media studies scholars and media industry scholars in particular? I'll be looking at the specific example of Hmong American media. So I'll discuss how have Hmong media industries been shaped by their size? And then what lessons can we learn from Hmong media about other small scale media outlets and industries? My main conclusion from all of this is that we need to be focusing more seriously on small scale media outlets of all as their own thing. I would say first, because this is actually a growing industry that we've been ignoring in favor of concentrating on like big conglomerates and networks and media giants. But I also think that we shouldn't assume that a small scale media outlet is one that is just failing on its path towards scaling up. Micromedia are actually really interesting and important on their own terms, even if they never grow. Okay, so let's jump right in with my term, micromedia. How do I define this term? So micromedia are small scale versions of media production and distribution. Their growth is limited by barriers that can include staffing, funding, or audience size. And together, this makes it impossible for them to scale up and take advantage of the economies of scale that more traditional media outlets have always relied on. But I would say the most important characteristic of micromedia is that it's just one or two people behind the scenes running it. So basically, I'm talking about mom and pop media outlets. So I apologize for the heteronormativity of that term. But basically, if you look behind the scenes, there's not a big paid staff. It's just one person working alone, or sometimes with a handful of part-time volunteers. There's a concept in business that's a micro business. So it's kind of applying that idea of a micro business to media industries, which, as you all know, operate kind of differently from other businesses. So to understand this concept better, I'll begin by triangulating it with some other related concepts. So niche media, ethnic media, and community media. There is a lot of overlap between what I call micromedia industries and other small scale forms of media, but I still think that this concept is distinctive enough to deserve more close attention. So I'll explain what I mean. We can start with micromedia versus niche media. So niche media target a very specific audience. They don't aim for general or mass audiences. So I'll give you a couple of examples. We would say that maybe Japanese manga and anime are considered niche, like this headline says. Japanese media is more popular than ever, so why are manga and anime still niche? And then I have this headline about the show Shmigadoon, which maybe some of you are familiar with. And they say Apple TV's delightfully niche Shmigadoon loves musicals enough to subvert them. Okay, so maybe these are what we would think of as niche media, but these are actually still enormous industries and products. They have teams of dozens of people making them, millions of dollars going into them. So niche media can also be produced in a traditional media industry, make millions of dollars, reach millions of audience members. So I would say they're not really micro at all. Another related term would be ethnic media. And this is definitely a term that can be used to describe all of the Hmong American media in the diaspora that I'm studying here. Ethnic media are culturally specific media that center an ethnic audience that gets left out of the mainstream. So most of the media that I look at for this study is actually in Hmong language, and being in language is another characteristic of ethnic media. But not all ethnic media are necessarily small in any way. You know, there are Chinese American newspapers and news platforms and Spanish language TV channels and media companies. They reach millions of subscribers and operate just like mainstream media, just targeting that specific ethnic audience. I have some examples here, like China Daily and Univision. They're ethnic media, but they're in no way micromedia. And of course, not all micromedia are ethnic media. There can be plenty of small scale media outlets that don't focus just on an ethnic minority. So I would say we still need a distinct term that refers to size alone. Okay, now community media. So I think the concept of community media is very close to what I'm talking about because it implies something distinctive going on behind the scenes. So community media like community radio or community television, they are also limited in their ability to financially profit. They're often made by volunteers, or their goal is not necessarily financial profit. This term is often used to describe outlets that have a very civic-minded goal associated with them, like democratizing media production or incorporating media production education, or sometimes even having like a really radical alternative political perspective. So I have some images here that kind of connote what I'm thinking about with community media, like the airwaves are public property. That's one sentiment that is connected to community media. We can see in this ad here, looking for radio presenters and producers for a new community radio station. Sorry, the text gets really, really little, but it does say for radio training and auditions, contact this number. I've got my like public access TV station. Okay, this is not what I'm talking about with micromedia. These are community media are emphasizing political goals, like educating citizens to become media producers. Not all micromedia have that kind of political goal. And community media are often actually tied to a specific geographic location. So it would actually be kind of strange to call like an international program community media, because community media are tied to a physically geographically bounded location. So I think that's another way why that micromedia is different from community media. Okay, so hopefully you can see why I thought it was important to focus specifically on size and scale and think about what changes when you have an entire media outlet run by just one or two people, when it would be hard to imagine expansion in any way. And I'm specifically looking at Hmong American media, as I said earlier. So I thought I'd also kind of introduce a little bit about who Hmong Americans are, since they have like a pretty specific background and how they came to the US. So the Hmong are an ethnic group. They don't have a nation state or a home country of their own. They've always been a minority ethnic group, and their history is all about being pushed from one location to another. They're originally from southern China, but a group of Hmong began migrating to Laos in the late 19th century to escape oppressive Chinese regimes, and then they settled into the hills of Laos. Then during the Vietnam War, the CIA enlisted Hmong fighters to join them against communist forces in what was called the Secret War, because the US was not supposed to be in Laos. And Hmong people suffered from massive casualties as a result of this engagement. And their alliance with the US and the Royal Lao Army led to retaliation by the communists, particularly after the US withdrew at the end of the Vietnam War. So Hmong families were being hunted down and killed, and they started fleeing across the Lao-Thai border, and then they ended up in refugee camps in Thailand. So they stayed in those refugee camps for many years. And then starting in 1975, they started dispersing across the globe to countries that would grant them political asylum. So there are now Hmong diasporic populations in countries like France and French Guiana and Australia and Canada and the US. So there are now over 330,000 Hmong in the US, and that number is growing all the time. I think, everyone's anxious to see like census data to figure out new demographic numbers that we can start using in all of our research presentations. But they're the largest Hmong, I have a number there. So the largest Hmong communities are in Central California and Minnesota and Wisconsin. There are other little pockets all over the United States. I think I saw there are around 3,000 Hmong Americans in Washington, and maybe some of you have seen Hmong farmers selling flowers at Pike Place Market. I think those are some of the ways that Hmong people are more visible in certain locations, especially in the Pacific Northwest. So as with all refugees, Hmong families were initially placed in locations where they had sponsorship and resettlement agencies that are willing to receive them. But then the clustering in certain cities and states is also the result of Hmong people in the US undergoing secondary migration, where after their initial settlement, they would relocate to places that have significant Hmong populations. So they were reuniting with families and that kind of thing. Okay, so how did I study Hmong American media? Well, my goal was to create a thick, rich portrait of the Hmong media landscape and learn what media meant to Hmong in the US. So these are some of the methods that I used. I conducted interviews with over 100 Hmong media producers and consumers. It's like 50-50 Hmong media producers, and then like 50 just like everyday Hmong people who pay attention to media. Some of my interviews were in English. Some of them are in Hmong using an interpreter. I am horrible at Hmong, so I could not have conversations in Hmong. And then for some interviews, I actually went into Hmong homes and had families show me how they were using media in their everyday lives. I had to go through a really extensive IRB application process to be able to go into a population. It was sometimes like elderly families, people that don't speak English, and just, going into people's homes is also like a different kind of IRB application. But it all was very, very helpful. I'm glad that I did it and went through that rigorous process so that I could have these really great conversations about how people are using media in their everyday lives. I traveled. I went all around Wisconsin, as I said, also Minnesota and the Twin Cities, and then also out to California. So I visited sites where media production were taking place. So that was whether sometimes like TV stations, radio, just people making YouTube videos, and then just kind of general field work. So visiting like Hmong cultural events, community centers, things like that. I also did some textual analysis. So I collected all of the English language Hmong American media that I could find and watched or listened to that, though there's not that much of it. For the Hmong language media, I worked with a team of Hmong American undergrads. So they would translate media broadcasts and texts, and then we would have weekly meetings and just kind of chat about what they saw or listened to. And that helped me also kind of understand what media was about. Okay, so that's my methods. And now I want to show you what I learned about Hmong media industries. So for the rest of my talk, I'm going to be introducing you to some of the micromedia entrepreneurs that I met over the course of my research. And through their stories, I'll be able to illustrate some of my broader findings about micromedia. I'll look at what kinds of struggles micromedia outlets face in terms of labor, and how they have overcome those struggles through innovation and entrepreneurship. I'll look at how they create power and authority through these very small outlets, and what consequences this kind of media power has for their communities. I'll look at how micromedia can both silence and give voice to marginalized communities, and what factors help those voices to survive amidst struggle and criticism. And finally, how micromedia outlets often necessitate creating new media platforms, with some examples of what I call hybrid media platforms. So these are things that I think expand or blur our understanding of mediums and genres. Okay, so let's meet some Hmong people. This is Steve Tao. He is a Hmong American man living in St. Paul. He runs a nonprofit called the Center for Hmong Arts and Talent. That's his main job today. But he founded one of the earliest Hmong newspapers called the Hmong Tribune in 1998, and it continued until 2016. There have actually been a few English language Hmong newspapers over the years, like this one, and this one is very similar to a lot of other small ethnic newspapers. He started it with the goal of putting out positive stories about his community, because he wasn't seeing very many stories about Hmong people in mainstream media, and then when he did see stories, they were often negative. So he had this as a kind of a side project while he was doing his full-time job. He had some volunteers that worked with him, but Steve himself served in a bunch of different roles. So if I looked at the masthead for this issue, and it says that he's the publisher editor, he's the managing editor, he's a staff writer, and he's a photographer. So what does this tell us about micromedia? Well, this kind of multi-skilling is definitely one of the distinctive markers of micromedia. So if there are not that many people working behind the scenes, each person has to develop many different forms of professional expertise and take on multiple roles at once. I think this is, you can use this model and way of thinking for many different kinds of small projects, like a student film project, where maybe if one person is making a student film, or a handful of people in a class are making a student film, then somebody is probably going to be writing and shooting and editing and scoring the finished project. So that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about, but it happens across all forms of micromedia. And something else that I thought was fascinating as I came to learn Steve's story was that he had done so much more than start this newspaper. He was actually involved in tons of other media projects, some of them all at the same time over kind of his lifespan. So I told you about the Hmong Tribune newspaper, but also his dad was a Hmong filmmaker. So Steve had worked in his dad Su Tao's video production business called ST Universal Video. And then in the 1990s, they decided to get into radio. So first they bought 3 hours a week for a program called ST Radio, and eventually they bought an entire sub-channel of an FM station. Then in 1997, he partnered with his niece Song Vang, and they created a web platform called Hmong Online. So users were creating profiles and posting on message boards. It was like an early version of Hmong Web 2.0. And this combination of different media activities was really effective because they allowed for synergy across these different platforms and outlets. So for instance, the Hmong Web platform and the newspaper could host advertisements for the radio show and the movies. And then instead of having paid subscribers to the newspaper, they would just send piles of them, like stacks of newspapers, along with their DVD deliveries to Hmong grocery stores. And then the stores would just put the newspapers on the racks and give them away for free. So these are some of the different ways that they had. He had many different outlets, but they were all working to keep each other alive on this extremely limited budget that we know micromedia are always operating under. It's also very difficult for a tiny micromedia outlet to have advertising. So for like the radio show or the newspaper, which are normally advertising supported outlets, that's nearly impossible for Hmong audiences. So they have to do this kind of innovation. So another important aspect of micromedia industries is that many of the individuals who run them are truly media entrepreneurs. God, they should be recognized as media entrepreneurs. Their work goes beyond merely owning an outlet. Their role requires innovative leadership. So at first glance, this might seem like just a guy who has a side project of writing for a free newspaper. But if you scratch beneath the surface, you uncover that there are all of these incredibly hardworking media professionals who have mastered all sorts of different roles and skills and created these micromedia empires. This is something that I saw again and again. So this is why I think it's important to recognize them as entrepreneurs and not just dismiss them as hobbyists or gig workers. Okay, let me introduce you to another Hmong media mogul. This is Duan Li. He is also in the St. Paul, Twin Cities area. I visited him at his offices in the Hmong Village shopping center there. And he also runs a Hmong micromedia empire like Steve does. So he has a video news show called Hmong TV 24 Hours. He has a radio program called Radio Hmong, and there's something he calls a Hmong business directory. So I'm going to focus specifically on his video news show, which I think is a really cool example of micromedia, because when you look at his news show, I think it's even more surprising than some of these other outlets to learn that it's just one guy working all by himself, because it's modeled so closely after traditional broadcast news stations. So these are just a handful of other, so this is the bottom one is the Duan Li one that I'm talking about, and the other ones are other examples of Hmong TV news. But these only live on YouTube. So they're just kind of jumping right into our streaming world of saying, this is where our audience is at. We don't need a full broadcast TV station to reach them. But when you look at them, it's clear they're picking up all of these conventions of traditional TV news outlets. The look and the feel of them is just like your broadcast TV station. There's clearly a desire to tap into the legitimacy and authority that come from legacy news stations. But it's just one guy and his camera. They dress very formally. There are these kind of like chyrons underneath explaining the topics. They bring on people for interviews. You can see them out in the field capturing events. They have anchors. Another thing that gets modeled after legacy TV station is that Duan Li on his YouTube videos takes commercial breaks. So instead of selling advertisements for like a traditional TV station would sell advertisements to another company, but he uses those commercial breaks to sell his own products. So he has like face creams and health products. Sometimes he has whole segments of interviews featuring his products, kind of like infomercials or like a home shopping channel. So this is another creative way for Hmong micromedia entrepreneurs to fund their outlets. And it's actually, pretty common in conservative media, like Alex Jones sells a lot of dietary supplements and creams and things like that. So another thing I would say about micromedia is that they build from the authority and legitimacy of mainstream media. This includes the styles and look of something like TV news, the genre norms, the flow of the show, where there's like show and commercial and show, and other qualities. And I think in some ways this points to how easy it would be to delegitimize micromedia, and how that threat is always looming, and how they have to work so hard to avoid that delegitimization. But of course, it is different from legacy television. It's only on YouTube. So that means that audiences are actually encountering it very differently from TV news. They have to search for it on the YouTube platform. So that actually means that like search engine optimization is really important. And actually the YouTube algorithm itself is really important in helping people to find the show or even know that it exists. It's also disassociated from a physical location, unlike local news programs that are about their local communities. People are tuning into these from all over in the world. When I saw people watching this show on their iPads, I could see that they would just kind of click around, like they would type in Hmong into the YouTube search bar and this show would pop up. And then sometimes it would just move on, the algorithm would move them on to another show. And they didn't really know this guy. They didn't really know where he was from. They definitely did not know that this show had never been broadcast on television. So if this is Hmong TV, we can see some of the conventions of television that are being sustained and then others that are being challenged or transformed. The way that they model themselves after TV and have developed the authority and legitimacy of mainstream TV comes to matter a lot when they deal with controversial issues. And this guy, Duan Li, and his show are actually pretty controversial. One time he called himself the Hmong Jerry Springer because of how he likes to rile people up. And lately when I was just clicking onto his YouTube channel and I saw he was talking about how Biden stole the election and Trump was robbed. So that's kind of like the tenor of his programs. But he really came under attack from the Hmong community when I was studying him a couple years ago when he posted a video that was really critical of Hmong divorced women. So he had a show where he said, divorced women are worthless and it's okay for Hmong men to marry young women in Laos. And there were a ton of very vocal Hmong women who organized to fight. They're always organizing to fight this kind of misogyny in their communities. So they responded right away and they had comments on the video. They made response videos and posted them on YouTube. There were Facebook posts. There was a change.org petition. This issue filled up my social media feeds for a while. But the way that it unfolded also communicated some interesting things about Hmong TV stations, like this one, as micromedia. It was clear from the way that people attacked the show that they didn't realize it was micromedia. So commenters would say things like, this man should be fired, or Hmong TV should have higher standards for its staff. They called for its broadcast license to be suspended. And all of these kinds of comments would make sense for a legacy TV station that has the hierarchy of staff where somebody is managing and making decisions about the on-air talent. And that's why, classic media activism is calling for all of these kinds of changes to happen. But none of them make sense in the context of micromedia. There's no staff, no one is getting paid, no one can be fired, there's no broadcast license, right? So one thing we can learn is that all of the markers of mainstream media that have been taken up are effective in creating a kind of media power that is definitely being accepted by the audience. All of these markers of mainstream media that are being taken up by Mr. Chia Li have given him the kind of status and authority that audiences assume of a television show. But this debate also points to the resilience of micromedia outlets. If an outlet is being created by just one person, like with their camera and editing it and putting it up on YouTube, then there's not really that much that people can do to make them stop creating media. So the audiences might shrink a little bit if he gets like a bad reputation. That could be kind of disappointing to him. But these outlets are defined by their small size already. So a shrinking audience is also not that big of a threat to them. So in this case, it might be kind of unfortunate that audiences couldn't get this show canceled. But we can think of also many cases where that resilience is admirable and powerful. Let's look at one of those cases. This is the case, these are some other Hmong media makers, Chu Fengxiong, Cam Yang, and Sonic Rain. So they were part of a radio program called Rong, and this is an hour-long show that was on the air every other week from 2016 to 2019. And it was broadcast on a radio station in St. Paul, 1590 AM. There's actually 3 radio stations owned by Hmong people in St. Paul, and Cam's mom, Mai Yang, was the owner of that station. It's actually really, really rare to have a Hmong woman in charge of this radio station. So this whole radio station itself, WIXK 1590 AM, is micromedia. The only staff are the owner, Mai Yang, her son, and a part-time engineer serving as paid staff. And then all of the shows are run by volunteers. So, and as I told in the story, she enlisted her other child, Cam, to do one of the shows. So that's like a classic tactic in micromedia, just having your family like help you out. Cam recruited their friends, Sonic Rain and Chu Feng, to do the show. Then three of them decided that it would be focused on Hmong American youth and specifically LGBTQIA plus issues. So Cam and Sonic identify as queer and trans, and Chu Feng identifies as a straight cisgender Hmong man. So he is kind of modeling allyship and giving a point of identification for straight cisgender listeners. So I think this show is really cool because it points to the freedoms and possibilities of micromedia, that they can have a radio show focused on this very specific but very important identity when there is so little LGBTQIA plus focused Hmong media out there. So in some ways, they stuck to the traditional conventions of radio. They would play some music. They would intersperse that with some interviews with guests. They would like play games, things like that. Of course, it's important to see LGBTQIA plus folks doing this kind of this kind of media making and fitting into professional norms. But they would also sometimes challenge those norms. For instance, one time Sonic Rain was a guest on a similar kind of Hmong radio show. It was this hour-long community radio program focusing on Hmong gender issues. And they were on a show called Polai, which means bad Hmong girl. And for this show, they brought in a Hmong playwright and then performed a little radio drama during each show. So that the one that I was listening to, they had a story about a Hmong woman who's in a bad marriage. She gets shamed and told she's a bad Hmong girl. But it's actually her husband who goes off and marries a girl in Laos, and it calls attention to these really troubling gender issues, kind of like what Duan Li was talking about too. So I thought it was really cool that they were doing this innovative thing of doing a radio play. Obviously, radio dramas used to be really important in the early days of radio broadcast, but now I don't know if we ever hear them on like the AM/FM dial. That would seem like a very strange thing to do. Sometimes we hear radio dramas on podcasting, which is very innovative and cool. But this was a way that they were using community radio and the flexibility of the audio medium to try something that we don't normally hear, especially not on like a clear channel station, which we're getting more and more of. One of the other ways that Hmong radio got to be creative was through their use of digital technology. So they would always actually broadcast. Oh wait, can you guys hear this? Or I can't remember if no, okay, then I'm just gonna put it on silently and you guys can see them. Okay, so while they were airing their radio show, they would also simultaneously have a Facebook Live video performance. You can see in this clip how cute they are. They do a lot of little dances and stuff. And I think that this serves a lot of different functions for their micromedia enterprise. So one thing is they're able to augment their audio only radio show with video. And that's fun because they're actually like quite entertaining. They like to dance and be silly. So it infuses a lot of joy and humor into the broadcast. And I also think that's very political of them, that they're showing the fun they're having and the love that they have for Hmong queer folks. But it also allowed them to form a kind of archive of their show. So radio is a very ephemeral medium. There's very little record of any kind of Hmong radio. But since Hmong would stream their show on Facebook Live, that made it a more resilient place for audiences to find and engage with them. So if someone missed the show, which would make sense because it was only on for 1 hour every other week, they could just watch it online later. And then of course it's free to post videos on Facebook. Unfortunately, when they stopped doing the show, they also took down their Facebook page, which destroyed their archive. I don't really know why they did this. But if they, I'm happy that they retained control over their voice. So if they want to delete their archive, that's up to them. But one of the things that's happened in this radio show is it kind of blurred the boundaries of radio, moving from an audio medium to a digital video medium. And that happens a lot with Hmong micromedia. That even if media entrepreneurs want to benefit from the legitimacy and professionalism of legacy media, what they're actually doing is expanding media beyond its expected boundaries. Okay, so I have micromedia build from the affordances of existing digital platforms. Free platforms like Facebook and YouTube offer a way to archive otherwise ephemeral content. But I'm going to talk more about this expansion of media boundaries with my next example, So the Duan Li. This is Duan Li. She's actually my Hmong language teacher. I took a Hmong summer class with her. She was very, very helpful. But she is a radio DJ. Unlike Cam and Sonic Rain and Feng, Chua does not have a radio show on an AM/FM radio station. She has a radio show on Hmong teleconference radio. Let me explain what I mean by that. So basically what Hmong communities have been doing is using free conference call software to create radio. So one person sets up a conference call on their computer. This is my little graphic, the guy with his red computer here. This is like the kind that businesses use to hold meetings, not a fancy video call like the one we're doing right now that someone had to pay for Zoom to get this hooked up and everyone has to have video, just the audio kind, where it's all people's voices and sound. So they share the number for people to call in on their cell phones, and the calls can hold up to 1,000 or 2,000 people all at once. And if they keep it on and some people talking all day long, then it's a form of radio. It has live programming 24/7. So the person who sets up the conference call is the owner of the channel, and they divide up the hours of the day and assign them to volunteer DJs, and they each focus on a particular topic. So they set the schedule kind of like broadcast radio, where there are sections for music and singing, and then sections for news, discussions about health and medicine, religion. There's a lot of call-in shows where people give advice, a lot of discussions about like Hmong families and customs and relationships, things like that. And a lot of people I talked to they couldn't even distinguish between traditional radio and the cell phone radio. It's just like, that's what Hmong radio has become. And this form of media is made possible by the specific affordances of mobile phones. So it's a way of getting around some of the limits of a community that has like financial limitations, technological limitations, like maybe not everyone has a good enough internet connection to do video. They're spread all over the country and actually all over the world in these little small pockets. And oftentimes they have a cell phone, but it's not like a fancy iPhone that can do everything. Sometimes it's just a phone that can make a phone call. So it relies on the fact that it's pretty easy now to get a wireless plan with unlimited minutes, and it's pretty easy to set up these conference calls. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the app Clubhouse, but this is basically Hmong Clubhouse. Okay, so this is a great example of how micromedia can be technologically innovative, because their main goal is to very specifically meet their audience where they're at. And in this case, we can see it's very difficult to even name this format. I call it teleconference radio. It's kind of a form of mobile telephony. It's kind of radio. It's kind of a streaming audio media. It's made by a computer. I feel like it's in that blurry space, kind of like how podcasts, you might ask if podcasts are still radio. I think, there's many ways that digital media challenge traditional definitions of media. But I call these formations hybrid media platforms, where they take multiple mediums and kind of blend them together and create something new that's hard to define and describe. I think Mblong's Facebook Live radio program is also an example of this. I think Dua Chiali's YouTube web television is another example of this. So hopefully you can see that Hmong people are not the only ones doing this kind of work, expanding certain platforms. It's one of the defining characteristics of our convergence culture that the borders between different mediums get blurry. But I do think that micromedia entrepreneurs should be recognized as pioneers in the creation of new hybrid media platforms. We are just seeing so much creativity and experimentation because people like Chua are obviously not okay with a world where Hmong people sitting in their homes alone have to remain isolated and disconnected. They're all trying to find a way to connect and reach out to each other. So there are a lot of really cool things going on with these teleconference radio programs. Much like the queer radio programs I was talking about earlier, they provide a really important space for marginalized community members to participate in creating media. In particular, one of the things that I was very happy to find out is that women are the primary owners, hosts, and participants on Hmong teleconference radio programs. So here's a picture from a website that I saw of a pretty typical show. And I'm not saying that men don't participate at all. Both men and women listen to the calls, and on occasion there'll be a show that's hosted by a man, but it's just very heavily skewed towards women, and women are taking up a lot of the leadership roles in creating this platform for women's voices. So just like Chua Li, who has one show about relationships and love stories, and one show about healthcare and nutrition. And she gets like 1,000 listeners every time she's running these radio shows. And she's very excited that she can run it just using her cell phone. So I think it's really important to talk about participation here as well. All micromedia are fairly participatory in the sense that there are really low barriers to entry if it's just one person deciding to get involved in media production. But these teleconference radio programs are actually a deeply participatory form of media that really invite people in. It's a bottom-up, non-hierarchical, participatory form of media that challenges our understanding of radio, which is usually all about gatekeepers and prestige. And Chua, when I talked to Chua about this show, she was really clear about the benefits of programs like hers for women. She says that she talked to other women listeners, and they say that they're facing a lot of issues in their lives and that their mental health really improves when they get to hear that they're not alone and facing some really challenging issues. She thinks these shows have really been a lifeline for women during these dark times. And she's also heard stories about how Hmong women have decided to stand up for themselves more after participating in these conference calls, which sometimes can give the shows a bad reputation among the husbands who are seeing a change in their wives. This also brings me to the less celebratory side of these shows, which is that in general, they have kind of a negative reputation among Hmong Americans. So when I would talk to Hmong audiences about these shows, they had all sorts of criticisms. People thought that they were embarrassing because there was so much fighting and conflict and drama that got aired out on these radio programs. They really worried about their moms and aunties who seemed addicted to the shows. They would say, oh, maybe only people who don't have jobs or people who don't have another meaningful way to spend their life are listening to them. And they also worried about misinformation being spread. So I heard a lot of stories about how, oh, they're so unregulated. You can say anything on them. And then I have a relative who is listening to the show and they learned something really awful, like that they shouldn't trust banks anymore, or that elders are spending all their money on like bogus creams and pills instead of going to see a doctor. Some of these criticisms fit into other larger fears about media and misinformation today. But I would also say that some of these criticisms seem really gendered. And let's remember that these shows are primarily run by women. So we know that women's media have always been criticized as less valuable, less trustworthy, too emotional, not professional, or intellectual. These comments also mirror fears about a lot of digital technologies, with the concerns around addiction and skepticism that the wisdom of the crowds could ever be as legitimate as actual professionals and experts. But as we learned with the case of Duan Li and his YouTube news show, micromedia are resilient. And as long as people want to keep running these shows, there's really nothing anyone can do to stop them. Okay, so here's my complete list of everything I've been talking about today. I've talked about how micromedia require multi-skilling on the part of the owner, how the owners should be recognized as entrepreneurs, how they benefit from the authority and legitimacy of mainstream media, how they're resilient against attacks, but also vulnerable to the whims of their owners. They have low barriers to entry, which is what makes them important vehicles for highlighting marginalized voices in many cases. How some of them build from the affordances of existing digital platforms, while others are quite technologically innovative, sometimes needing to create their own hybrid media platforms. Hopefully you can hear from my explanation, I feel more strongly about some of these characteristics than others. There are just so many kinds of micromedia out there. I don't want to reduce their complexity too much in my efforts to highlight how important I think they are. But as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, Hmong people are doing really interesting and important things with micromedia, but they are not the only ones. Micromedia are all around us. So I thought I would conclude by gesturing to some other kinds of outlets and platforms that also deserve closer examination as micromedia because of how their size and scale has shaped them. So here's just a partial list. Well, it's kind of a long list, actually. Okay, rural newspapers. So the whole world of hyper-local journalism, like all the papers serving towns in rural Washington. Documentary films made in the one-man band style. Actually, I study a lot of Asian American documentary films, and I think a lot of them fit into this category. Influencers making social media content on all sorts of niche topics. YouTubers or Instagrammers who run their own accounts and make their own content. Musicians who just post their songs to Spotify instead of trying to sign a record deal. Food bloggers writing about their own recipe, but also any kind of blogger just writing by themselves instead of with like a professional network. The vast majority of podcasters are micromedia, except for those few professionals who are lucky enough to work with like The Ringer or Gimlet or one of those podcasting companies. Fan media, so fan entrepreneurship, other fan makers, people who make fan works like fan fiction fall into this category. Fan works also create a lot of hybrid media platforms. I don't know if you guys have heard of podfic, but this is a blending of podcasting and fan fiction. Okay, so here, hopefully you can see what I'm saying. There's just a lot of different kinds of micromedia out there. When we look at these forms of media as micromedia, I think there are important questions that could be asked and different kinds of orientations that we should take to them. For instance, are we creating professional training programs that speak to these realities? Is this how we're framing journalism school or film school? We should also be thinking about sustainability because micromedia outlets lead to a lot of burnout. There's the obvious lack of professional support from colleagues, and then the pressure of feeling like if you step back for a second, then the whole enterprise will crumble. I've also pointed to how these outlets are sometimes treated as if they're not professional or not as important as more traditional media outlets. If these are important parts of our media landscape, how can we make sure that they are supported? How can we make sense of their actual contributions? Whose voices are being highlighted and whose are being silenced? And how does the size and scale of these outlets shape their ability to be heard and taken seriously? Above all, I hope to have inspired more respect for the amount of time, energy, and labor that these skilled professionals are putting into creating media that meet the specific needs of their communities. So that's all I have for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Lori. That was a fantastic talk with a fantastic topic. I love how you organize things by themes, and I love your thick descriptions and the kind of takeaway points and broader implications of that is great. So we'll open up to the audience for Q&A. Again, as a reminder, if you want to ask a question, you can go to reactions on Zoom and then raise hand like I just did. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to think about it, and I'm going to start with my question while people are thinking. So I think this is a fascinating topic. I jotted down a lot of notes, a lot of interesting points. Let me start by them. I'm interested in the continuity aspect of Hmong media, especially since you were talking about burnout a little bit. I'm thinking about what sociologist Max Weber was saying, the succession problem of organizations is often one thing that is very difficult for these organizations to continue to run. And especially since this is a diaspora community and the identification process may kind of taper out as we see in a lot of, I don't know if that's true, you have to tell me, but in other immigrant populations, often the identity with their ethnic group kind of tapers away as time goes on. Like, for example, I'm from Taiwan myself. I know I strongly identify as a Taiwanese, but some people who grew up in the United States, although their parents are Taiwanese, they don't really feel that they are Taiwanese. Are you seeing a similar problem in the Hmong community, and how does that affect the community, the continuity of Hmong micromedia industries?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And that's really important in seeing the overlap between ethnic media and the specific case that I looked at here. Mm-hmm. So I definitely, well, first I'll say the burnout issue is definitely its own reason why Hmong media come and go. And over the course of studying these media, even some of the ones that I've talked about today, like the radio show that I talked about with the queer voices, that one is, no longer, when I was writing it, it was going well and I was talking about it in present tense. And then by the time I checked in with them, it had already been canceled. And then I was like, oh, back to past tense, I guess. So this happened with a lot of different shows and especially like Hmong newspapers. There's been so many over the years. There's been a lot of magazines too. Those are even faster to rise and fall, that people are spring forward with this beautiful idea about how they're going to help so many Hmong people with their print publication. And then they're like, oh, that was exhausting. There's no way I can continue doing that. So there's a lot of labor issues around that. But you're also completely right that people's feeling that they want to do something for their ethnic community also waxes and wanes over the course of their life. I think we see this a lot in actually college students, that college students often like discover their Asian American identity while they're in college and are very inspired to do a lot of like Asian American activism or student organizing or just being in community with their fellow students. And then over their lifespan, they like find other interests in like other political affiliations, other identity affiliations, and then the passion that they had for like creating an Asian American blog or something like that will also wax and wane. And I've seen that in a lot of my other research as well. So I think that fits into my sort of the both the tenacity and vulnerability of micromedia, that it's so easy to start and that's exciting, and it's easy for people to just jump right in and that's great. But as soon as just something changes in their life, like a lot of times, like it's people have a baby